When you hear of climate change, it is automatically understood to be a Western concept. But desertification, famine from drought, radiation bringing about severe climate hazards, these are all disasters that developing nations are also facing. Yet their stories remain unheard, and they're left to the unfortunate fate. The climate change dilemma has had repercussions upon all of our nations, yet it has been plagued with hypocrisy. Agendas have been created without contextualization or adaptability. Developing countries cannot be expected to transition to sustainable outcomes if there's no other viable method by which to provide basic needs for life. Our predecessors have failed us. Therefore, it is in our hands, the youth, to establish shared commitments and realities. We must establish intergenerational alliances where the youth from the global south will regulate the activities that which for decades have destroyed our natural habitats. We as a planet are in danger, and it is only through an inclusive cooperation we can prosper.
Economy and ecology both share the Greek prefix eco, which derives from oikos, meaning house. So if ecology is the study of our house, then economy should be the proper administration of it. But our current economic system, based on consumption and exploitation of natural resources, is destroying it. The escalating climate crisis leaves no question that change must take place now. Action starting with individuals have to lead to households, communities, and whole cities. We must begin at the core and focus on problematics such as the lack of alternative work opportunities to low-class population that work on ecosystem-damaging industries. As someone who will live and raise children in a changing world, I fear what awaits us. That's why we, the youth, must disregard elders' underestimation towards us, push to be more involved in politics, and create the mass change we need to protect our house.
Forum and to this special panel taking a look at the biggest challenges, one of the biggest challenges facing the world, the climate crisis, and the need for governments and individuals to wake up to it more than we have. Obviously, climate change is one of the #1 issues that governments are tackling. We've got COP26 coming up very shortly in Edinburgh. Governments, both local and national, in countries around the world have been making commitments, but there's much more to do. And taking a look at further solutions that are needed to go above and beyond where we are today is the main issue that we want to talk about on our panel today. So I'm really pleased to welcome here in person, first of all, Philip Glanville, the Mayor of the Hackney Borough of London. You are also co-leading a new Green Deal for London with the Mayor of London. And I want to come back to you in a moment because you've been doing a huge initiative at the local level that is tangibly contributing to reducing carbon and helping to tackle climate change. I also want to welcome our other guests. Speaking to us from afar, Matt Brittin with Google. You're the head of European and Middle East operations. Google has obviously been doing quite a lot as a company to not only reduce its carbon footprint, but to look at the bigger issues, especially with the help of data, that people are interested in seeing tackled. And we're really also very pleased to see Ivan C. Joining us from afar. You're the president of the C Foundation, and Ivan is going to be giving us an interesting perspective from the cultural angle. Culturally, how can we do more to address the issue of climate change and get it more into the minds and hearts of people? Unfortunately, Angelina Pouponneau wasn't able to join us today, but we have more time to sort of discuss amongst ourselves and also take questions from you all towards the end of this session. So as you have questions, please get them ready, and I'll be calling on the audience a little bit before we wrap up. But Mayor Glanville, if I could turn to you, I mean, one of the questions is, why aren't governments sort of, what more is it that governments can do to really press this forward? London is a capital that has already done a great amount. Again, you're basically helping to co-lead this new Green Deal. Tell us what has gone right in the initiatives that you have taken so far, and what isn't going right, what more it is that you need to do that could also be a model for other cities that are trying to work at a ground level to tackle climate change.
Thanks, Liz, for the framing. And I think another element is coming out of COVID and what type of society and what type of public realm, what type of city that we want to see. And I think we've seen some clues from that period. There were those times in lockdown where our air was cleaner, our streets were free of private vehicles, but there were also, as we moved out of lockdown, that tendency to return to a car-led recovery. And I think what we've seen at the forum is a move from the wake-up phase, the talk-think phase, towards the doing phase and what we're going to do practically on the ground. And this stage has had presidents and prime ministers on it, but I think there's been a failure at a national leadership level. There's been some frameworks. We've had climate acts in the UK. We're on COP26, as you said, so there's a sense we've had the COPs previously, and we haven't seen that really unlocked. And I think and firmly believe that it is the local level you have to unlock to ensure that we get not just the action on climate change that we want to see, but the change in our communities, the nature-led recovery that we want, and that also we involve the citizen level in that work. Failure to do that, we will miss the opportunities of social justice, green recovery, and green jobs. And what we've been doing in London, I'm just going to take one theme around active travel, is to think about how we can reimagine the city away from the private motor car. And there are obviously people that are involved in EV vehicle transition, and that is an absolutely important act. And in London, we're really proud of the work that we've done around that infrastructure to invest in EV technology and make that easier for businesses and citizens to transition. The problem is, if we just do that, we're transitioning a society based around the private car. Already in Britain, land transport emissions have overtaken energy contribution to climate change. And there's some really stark statistics at a national level. Before COVID, every morning, 36 million seats in cars were unfilled. So people are driving all around the country, and there are 36 million cars. The average occupancy of a car is 1.2 people. So if we simply take that old model and apply it to a new model, we're going to invest far too much in EV vehicles. So we have been taking the steps as a city to invest in active travel. So it's thinking about how we restrict private motor car use and the most polluting vehicles. London-wide, that's represented by the ultra-low emission zone, which is the Mayor of London's plan to effectively charge the most polluting vehicles to come into the centre. But my borough in Hackney sits just outside the city centre, and it has some of the lowest car ownership anywhere in Britain, some of the highest number, if not the highest number of trips taken by walking, cycling and public transport, but it also has some of the worst air. 40% of the vehicles moving through our city are not from Hackney or contributing to that place. So we've been introducing low traffic neighbourhoods, which is where you don't close roads permanently, but you restrict through traffic access. And now we've got a position where 25% of our streets have that approach. And we're seeing the impact on air quality, the take-up of walking and cycling, and you also start to get the chance to reimagine what roads can be. So you can de-pave, you can create parklets, you can do urban tree planting, changing what the city is, but also improving its resilience. Because one of the themes here has been about resilience. We're seeing increased flooding in Europe, we've seen the fires here in Greece, and we've seen the impact of heat. The solutions to that are not concrete and car-based. We need to reimagine what our streets can be and make sure that they're ready for that transition. So for me, it is about being more ambitious than just transitioning existing ways of transport, economy, into something far more better and sustainable.
Yes, I mean, that's definitely a challenge facing many politicians, is the desire to be more ambitious, and where that also collides with a society that, especially, the environment is much more in people's consciousness these days than it ever was before. Matt, you've talked about how, the Google searches, bear that out. But I mean, just quickly, how do you deal with, is there at the same time any sort of, backlash or resistance among citizens who recognize that really the only way to deal with climate change is also on an individual basis through their own actions, but whose lives would have to be changed fairly dramatically by, no longer driving, their car if they're the only person in it. A lot of people say, for example, it's a great idea, I love bikes, but I can't take a bike to work all the time, it doesn't work for me. So how do you deal with those sort of human issues?
I think there's a real danger that it is a polarising debate that fractures society even further. And you've got groups that we'll all be familiar with, campaign groups like XR, civic society groups. We were in a previous session this morning which was looking for the big idea. And then you have the practical role of elected politicians that have to take their communities with them. And to be frank, we have to win elections to show that leadership. I think it's absolutely important that we show that leadership, but we also invest in the co-production. So there's platforms like Commonplace in the UK where you're allowed to go out there and talk about what do you like about an area, what would you like to change, how are the different ways of travel impacting on individual lives. There's also that sense, and I have it all the time talking as a politician to citizens, I am not asking everyone to get on a bike. Not everyone can, not everyone is able to, there are issues of disability and equality. What I'm saying is if you look like me and you're currently driving around in a private motor car, you should be considering a bike. That frees up road space. The bus is an incredibly important tool here. We need bus prioritisation in cities. We need the affordability of public transportation to be invested in. I think that's what we're doing in London, is having a holistic approach. It's walking, it's cycling, it's scooting, it's personal mobility, it may be e-scooters. Right. All of that has a part to play. And if it just becomes a sort of young people on bikes debate versus people that may have disability or large families in cars, we can't allow that to happen. There's also a final bit I think about business. Peer-to-peer networks supporting small businesses around EV vehicles, around things like cargo bikes are much more powerful than just top-down targets. You can say that we're going to no longer have internal combustion engine vehicles sold in the UK from 2030. But you have to have the right infrastructure in place for that transition. Otherwise, small businesses will feel pressure. So when we closed one of our major town centre streets to through traffic, we also, at the same time in Hackney, launched an e-cargo bike scheme with the Mayor of London. Either those two initiatives have to sit side by side. Otherwise, people will say it's being done to them, and there are no alternatives.
Well, let me pivot off of that, if I may, to Matt. Matt, let me talk to us a little bit about sort of what, first of all, I mean, briefly, we know that, Google has taken huge strides as a company to basically reduce its own carbon footprint. But, besides that, in terms of searches, the searches that you all see with regard to climate change, can you talk to us a little bit sort of about, what the number one issue seems to be on people's minds based on what you all are observing? And also, how that might reflect, you've said before that, there is a business cost to sort of not taking action. Talk to us a little bit about sort of what that means and, what the follow-through is on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very clear that governments, companies and communities have to work together to tackle these challenges, and it's very inspiring to hear Philip talking about what he's doing at a community level. What we see in terms of consumers searching over the last 5 years, we've seen nearly 5x the volume of searches for sustainable goods. If you look at Alderman's Trust Barometer, it's a really helpful tool across many, many countries. You see that over 70% of people are concerned or fearful about the consequences of the climate crisis. So we definitely see people turning to information sources to try to make smarter choices. That's one thing which we try to do, is help people to be better informed about smarter choices. Second thing for us is the tools that we build. So obviously there are the consumer tools that you know about, like how to insulate your home or how to find a healthier way to get to work. These are things which people use every day. But we need to bring our engineering and science into the field as well. So working with cities like Hackney, or I was looking at a project yesterday in Kampala, where we're supporting local engineers to collect via air sensors data about where pollution sits. And I think there's a big piece here around getting data that allows local decision makers, communities and families to manage their situations better. And then there's obviously a huge responsibility on companies such as ours to try to provide leadership, just as we heard from the Mayor. It's up to all of us to try to provide leadership, and what we do at Google is obviously being carbon neutral, we're the first big company to go carbon neutral back in 2007. We've set ourselves the goal to be carbon free in all our data centers in the next 10 years. And actually, we're well on the way towards that. So we've got data centers in Europe, which are running 90% of the time now on renewable energy. So we're trying to pioneer ways and then share what we've done with other people. But come back to the essential point, which is this requires national governments, communities and companies and local organizations to come together, bring these tools to the fore and put them to work hard. And the urgency, I think, is there. Even though individuals and families are facing incredibly tough times, they remain concerned. And I think that's what, the elected politicians should be hearing as they're going to Glasgow for COP26. People care about this stuff. They've seen in the pandemic what we can do when we move governments, companies and communities together, and they want to see that change from our leaders on climate.
Oh, great. You cut out like the last 15 seconds you cut out there, but let me come back to you on a couple of points that you made. Before I do that, I'd love to move it over to Ivan. We heard most of what you said, don't worry, just the last 10 seconds or so. Ivan, thank you so much for joining us afar. As the head, talk to us a little bit about, in your role as head of the Sea Foundation, talk to us a little bit about what culture, the role of culture in the overall climate change, not only the debate, but the role that culture is playing and can play in terms of perhaps raising the level of consciousness, not only among individuals, but among our leaders about tackling climate change in a better, more purposeful way as we move forward.
Great. Well, I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. So I think we've waited for this moment for a while. I think that there is greater alignment now between governments and the private sector and consumers. And so one of the questions that we look at is, how does the cultural sector help move the climate conversation forward from here? I think we're always trying to move it from the fringe to the critical mass. And in that sense, I think in terms of culture, design is important. Design is concerned with how something looks and feels. And I think, as with a building, it doesn't just happen. So if we want increasing climate-facing culture, the same kind of thoughtful planning will go into it. And I think we have a few examples from the past in the cultural sector that we can point to for inspiration.
And is there a particular example that you'd like to bring out? Because I'm also very interested in the theme of climate adaptation that you've raised. Yeah, so I think I have 3 points and there's sort of 3 examples that correlate. So let me just very quickly go through what I think would be needed to take us to the next stage of the climate conversation. The first thing I'm calling a climate beacon. The second, climate adaptation as a lifestyle. And the third, climate as a gateway. So let me briefly explain each of these. A climate beacon is necessary because we've reached an inflection point in human history. With the latest IPCC, the UN has issued a code red for humanity, with the sober words that we're on the verge of an abyss. I think this is still news to many people who are just now making a connection between climate and extreme weather. And for, I think, climate message. So now that the climate being to color for climate, it's forever the #1 existential. So, we're suggesting a fire bell to ring out loud and clear, alerting everyone to the fact that we're, at a code red. And I think when we do this, we have to remember hope. And this is the reason it's called a beacon, not simply an alarm. We mustn't forget hope. Right. We really need hope.
And for some, mention of the climate crisis brings a feeling of hopelessness.
Right. And
And
how
that
does
we know that it all.
how do lifestyles be shifted in your view then? Yeah.
Right. So now I think we're ready to focus a little more on the adaptation side, because we realize that climate change is already happening. And I think that we need to, develop a lifestyle that sort of helps us adapt to it. And again, this has to be designed. And the example that we have in the past is the Quit Smoking, Non-Smoke movement, which was a multi-pronged effort that fundamentally changed the definition of smoking, both personally and privately.
Right. And then finally, sorry, you wanted to mention also your idea of climate gateway. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, that one's, it strikes me that, right now, it's not that we don't really know what to do about climate. What we lack is, a collective sense of ethics and the political will to get there. And that's not something that, perhaps our minds can fix by themselves. And so what we need to do is essentially amplify the human spirit so that we can address climate change from a different perspective and according to a different logic. Astronauts who've come back have called this the overview effect. And so we may have to design such a gateway so that, climate triggers a fundamental immune response that spiritually revitalizes each of us.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and in many ways, sort of that the last point that you just made is not perhaps brought up enough in the conversation, in the bigger conversation that is being held when politicians work with policymakers, companies, and individual actors to try to forge solutions that will take us beyond where we are now. Philip, I saw you sort of nodding your head on a couple of points there. One of the things Ivan mentioned, of course, was design and how important of a role that can play. You had made reference to that, to the need for design in terms of infrastructure. For example, infrastructure has a way of influencing people's behavior in a concrete way. What can be done better? Because sometimes if those plans, are not necessarily actually laid out in an optimal way, it can sort of inhibit the goal that you're trying to reach.
Yes, I was also sort of thinking about the hope point. I think there's a bleakness. The opening video, the sense of generational theft, I guess, that a generation before has destroyed the planet and now I'm going to have to live in it. I think those are really powerful things, but there is a hopeful way forward. If you look at the sort of 20th century street, and this is an archetype and it's not going to be where everyone lives, but we all live on a street. The 20th century street evolved into being designed around the private motor car. And the very worst of them are, a row of houses, cars parked along either side of that street, no trees, no urban infrastructure, a place that you just pass through and you can't wait to get into your home and into your private space, and then you might have a green space in the back garden. I know I'm describing a British street, but there'll be versions of this in suburbia. And if you compare that to the sort of 21st century street that I've been talking about, an urban environment that's built around people, you reduce the car dominance in terms of parking, you create the space for greening, you can bring in on-street cycle parking, you can start depaving, which makes better sustainable urban drainage. You start to take those moments where, rather than just rushing back and forth, you play on the way, you walk to school. It's the opportunity for businesses to reimagine what they might do in that public realm. And so you have a more pleasant and beautiful urban environment and a place that is more climate resilient. And I think those two things together are a very hopeful example of kind of new urbanism. And you can play around with it. You can add, water drinking fountain. You can add numerous aspects to it and co-design that with local residents. So for me, this could be a really hopeful opportunity for urban renewal, and local communities should be challenging their politicians to say, why do my streets not look like that? And there's actually a bit of competition, I think, you can inject into a place like London, where you've got London boroughs. There's a diversity of political leadership, but even between municipalities, and you're starting to see that, the expectations about what a street should be.
Yeah.
And it's not reductive, it's not a negative thing, it's not taking things away from people, it's adding to it. And I think that's where you bring the culture, urban design, hope part. And then there's, I think what we heard from Google is really important, open data. You know, you can start to say, you know, how many trees are on my street? What's the tree canopy? Can I look at that sort of data, and then can I use that as a campaign tool?
Well, let me actually pop that back over to Matt. Can you hear us, Matt?
Yeah, hi.
Okay, great. We can hear you at last again. I mean, I don't know if you want to respond to Philip's point about, you know, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few of the things that we see being really helpful are, you know, satellite imagery. We have Google Earth, but the quality of imagery now that's possible for monitoring things like deforestation, for looking at things like fire prevention and so on. These are kind of helpful tools. And working with this AI revolution that we've got going on, we can start to spot patterns that we couldn't spot previously, both in terms of direct impact on the environment, but also, as Phil was talking about, at a local level. So I do think having better data allows us to kind of make better decisions on these things. Second thing I'd say is, we talked a bit about consumer choices in here. Yeah, yes, it's going to be great if we can see our streets changing over time, but that's going to take multiple years. Helping people make better choices every day is something that, you know, we're trying to do as our day job, and we're going to try to help 1 billion people make more sustainable choices in the next year through things like, you know, when you're searching for a route on Google Maps, we offer you less damaging routes. When you're looking at flights, trying to find flights that are going to be putting less carbon into the atmosphere or suggesting alternatives. So you can imagine the kinds of things that are more than nudges, that are helping you with better facts to make decisions. And being so heartened by how much consumers care about this, I think it's really helpful for us to do that. Second thing is, obviously, there's competition. Philip mentioned the word, and I think he's absolutely right. You know, companies are competing for consumers' business every day. And those who can offer an environmentally better choice are going to win more business from those 70+% of people who are really concerned about the climate crisis. And we all need to work together to try to do that at a price that is affordable and actually is a better price for people. And I am really also encouraged by some of the big companies like Unilever and others who are trying to take the lead on setting out bold targets for sustainability, doubling their business while halving their environmental impact. So sometimes you kind of see different constituencies pointing the finger and saying governments saying companies should do more, companies saying governments should do more, or communities. But it really is something where we have to work together and have to collaborate and share that sort of data and those open tools that we just mentioned. So we're really committing to that and trying to work with governments, communities, and individuals and families.
So let me just ask you a quick question. We have students who are here at the Athens Democracy Forum who are incredibly interested in climate change and basically ways to sort of, you know, for them to work in their daily lives and indeed perhaps, you know, forge careers with the goal of making a more carbon-free future happen. I mean, one of the questions that some of them asked me earlier to ask you all is that, I mean, we're talking about businesses. Businesses have been taking climate pledges. They are now, you know, shareholders are starting to ask questions and even to penalize companies that aren't doing enough. At the same time, there remains, you know, a pretty widespread impression that companies, there's a concern that companies are at the same time engaging in greenwashing, or that some of the steps that companies are taking that might be kind of carbon neutral on one end might be polluting at another end. Somebody mentioned the example, for instance, of electric batteries for cars. Great, you know, no carbon emissions, but the mining of nickel and other precious metals that's needed for that can be very polluting in countries, non-Western countries, that are vital sources for those resources. So could you talk a little bit about sort of that sort of, you know, dichotomy, and you know, what is a way for us to move past that? I mean, I'd love, Matt, if you could give a brief answer, but I also wonder if Ivan would have a perspective on that.
Yeah, I'll try to give a brief answer. I hope the technology allows us to continue to hear each other. So I think you mentioned investors, and ESG goals, I think, are something that are really powerful now for companies. You know, I was on the board of a big grocery retailer for the last few years, and the boards are looking at how they demonstrate reality about what they're doing in this climate crisis. And I think that's helpful. Second thing you mentioned actually was workers. And those students that are in the audience, you know, you have the power by who you choose to work for to make a choice about those companies that are committing more to this fight and to playing their part in it. So I think those two constituencies can really help hold companies accountable. There is a role for data in that as well, as I said, and if we could get clearer standards of data and reporting, just like we have in some countries now on things like gender, pay equity, it will help us to see more transparently those who are making the most progress. But I think investor communities can't be underestimated here. You know, they're the pension funds, right? They're the investment vehicles that are owned by everyone, and they need to be doing the work for everyone, and they should be hearing this data about how concerned citizens are and putting that to work in their investment decisions. So I think investors and workers have a big part to play in holding companies accountable, and those companies who are smart will realize that if they want to be successful in the long run, they need to do it by doing right.
All right. That was great up until 5 seconds ago. But Ivan, do you have a perspective on this from where you sit?
Yeah, well, again, I think this belongs in a wider context of a cultural conversation that has yet to be developed. And I think, yeah, we have to, you know, take baby steps, right? And I think things that are greener are greener. And yes, you know, we still, you know, want to live in a kind of modern society in the way that we are. And so there are limitations to what we can do tomorrow. But I'm very encouraged by the conversation that's been happening. It's now the central discourse, so I'm sure it'll only get better from here.
Yes, and that's something that could give people hope, is that it really has to get better from here. There can't be any going back. I mean, we have this sort of huge momentum that's happening. There are a lot of growing pains, but one thing perhaps that people can be encouraged by is the fact that there is forward momentum. I want to open it up to questions from the audience. If you could raise your hand, and we'll send the microphone over to you. Yes?
Hello, my name is Nadia Andrade. I'm from Ecuador and for the Global Liberal Arts Alliance. And I'm studying biology, so I'm interested in, so for fighting climate change, we need science, of course, but scientists are not normally included in these important political discussions. And neither are people from indigenous communities from the Global South or others that are also experiencing the effects of climate change directly. So in which specific ways can we make a better connection between science and politics? And how can science and politics language be more approachable for the rest of the population to understand the urgency of the matter and to act?
That's a great and very difficult question. Who would like to take that one?
I'll start us off. I think they're both really powerful points.
Yeah.
There's been a hollowing out, I think, of city government and municipalities all around the globe due to austerity. So we've lost some skills and we've never built the skills that we've needed. So there's a huge piece of work happening in Britain around nature recovery and biodiversity and capturing whether development contributes a net contribution to nature recovery and development. Now, that is a national law that I'm passionately in favour of. Unfortunately, the unfunded bit is, can we hire the right people to hold development to account? So I think seems to be common across the world, that we're being asked to do things as cities, and so we're going to have to collaborate in new ways with business, NGOs. I can see colleagues from the Resilient Cities work nodding behind you. The second part of your question is, most of us are going to be peering into COP26 from the outside, whether they're in the global south or they're in developed countries. So making sure that the voice of those that have an intrinsic impact of climate change happening now on them, but also can be part of the solution, I think is absolutely essential. Those citizen movements. During my time at this conference, I have discovered I will be at COP. Up until very recently, the voice of local government, even in the UK, even in the host country, was being kept away. One of the people in Hackney who works for the Bolivian embassy is going to be at COP, whether COP wants it or not. I know she's going to lead a delegation of Latin American Londoners to COP and make sure that that voice is heard.
Yeah.
And it's up to politicians to also bridge those two gaps. Just because I get the pass, I shouldn't forget those that don't.
Right, and the question about the Global South and, you know, the danger that the Global South is sort of left behind in all of this. I mean, Matt, do you have a perspective on that?
Well, yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. One, half the planet is now connected and the other half are going to be connected to the internet over the next 5 years. So although there are always going to be people we're really concerned about at the very poorest level, you are now getting citizens being able to see and be active in this debate in a way that was never possible even 5 or 10 years ago. So, you know, the majority of people now have access and can be scrutinizing things. And then secondly, I think, you know, Liz, the media has a role to play here in holding people accountable and explaining the science and working with scientists and others, as we do. You know, we want to make it easy for you to assess your choices on climate. It's pretty hard at the moment. You know, what do I do in terms of gigaton choice on flight or something? So I think there's a role for all of us to make it more transparent and more accountable. I actually think quite a lot of jobs will be created in this field of understanding the data and explaining it around the world. So I think really important. We should also be realistic, though. I talked to key leaders in Africa recently, and, you know, in the run-up to COP, their main concern is around vaccination supplies. So, you know, we have got crises on crisis, and we need to make sure that we're supporting the things that are most important in those countries, as well as encouraging them to participate through technology and innovation in tackling the climate crisis too.
Right. One more. We have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Yes, hi. Michael Berkowitz from Resilient Cities Catalyst. We're a nonprofit. We're here actually announcing a climate hub for Southern Europe with EMEA and the Democracy and Culture Foundation. And the goal of that is to, you know, have a platform where private sector, civil society, and government can share best practice and scientific information about climate. And that's a lead up to my question, which is saying that these groups should collaborate more is, like we say in the US, motherhood and apple pie. It's, of course, that should happen, but yeah. Could we get a little bit more tangible? Like from philanthropy, Yvonne, what do you need from government in order to make better grants? What does the private sector need from government? What do you need from the private sector and philanthropy in order to really affect the kind of change we need at the speed we need it in the coming years?
Right. Yvonne, that's over to you. The hardest question is always the last.
Well, I think increasingly philanthropy should look at how they can partner and collaborate with the private sector in a way to reach government. I think that there's a lot of the NGO work that's been done. Of course, that's historic and ongoing. But I think, especially in terms of cities, there's lots of good ideas and plans that we can spearhead. And of course, 100 Resilient Cities came up with urban resilience strategies for different cities. And I think philanthropy can help actualize some of those. I think from what last time I heard, they're still at various stages of development. So philanthropy should really get into this conversation around how we live with climate change, especially in the developed world, I think.
Great. Well, I mean, this is obviously a subject that we could go on about for a considerably longer time, but unfortunately, that's one thing that we've run out of is time. I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us and, you know, for the views that you shared. I mean, it's clear that, you know, there is, forward momentum on climate change. There is a vision, but at the same time, you know, there are growing pains and there's a need for more concrete solutions that go beyond some of the sort of pat statements that we hear sometimes that contribute sometimes to skepticism, and we need to do more to basically sort of generate hope that this bigger goal can be achieved, as Ivan said. So thank you all for being with us, and we will look forward to our next panel.